Dr. Roubini, thank you so much for joining us today. You know, I've heard you call yourself a global nomad. I mean, you travel the world talking to individuals, investors, politicians, central bankers. I'm really interested in your take on how would you grade the West and the U.S. In particular on financial literacy and education?
Well, my view is that there is a very limited amount of financial literacy, not just in the United States, but also in other parts of the world, including advanced economies and emerging markets. You know, people don't understand very much the economic jargon. They don't understand basic issues of finance. And that's a problem. It's a problem because as individuals, we make a whole series of decisions that depend on understanding what's happening in the US and the global economy and financial markets. You know, from the beginning where you decide to go to school and what you decide to study, or what your job should be as your first job or other jobs, as you have all these major changes in trade and globalization. They're going to shift entire sectors of the global economy. How much you should consume, how much you should save. And when you save some amount of money, in which kind of assets, domestic or foreign, you should put your money. When those key decisions are going to have implication about your income stream over your lifetime, about your wealth, about your investment both in human and physical and financial capital. And my sense is that most people don't understand these things. You know, understanding even one economy is complicated enough. Understanding linkages between United States, Europe, China, Japan, emerging markets, it's even more complicated. Understanding all these different issues having to do with economic policy, monetary and fiscal policy is complicated. And then relating all these economic and policy developments to what happens to stocks, bonds, currencies, commodities, FX, credit, fixed income, bonds. It's even more complicated, but it's necessary because each one of us makes some decisions of our lifetime that are economic and financial decisions, and our own welfare and success depend on making the right decisions, but many people don't know much about them.
And not understanding, it's almost an understatement. I mean, you even see in studies that people who are engaged in the markets, it's not just people who aren't engaged in the markets that have this lack of financial literacy, but people who are engaged don't even have a clear understanding of what they're engaged in the markets and what drives this. Are we doing a better job in the U.S. than in Europe? What's your review of that?
I'm not sure if we're doing a better job in the U.S. than in Europe. I would say that probably having some basic understanding of economics and of finance would be necessary. Even at the high school level, certainly anybody should go to college, should take some courses in micro, macro, international economics, and basic finance. And I don't think that.
Irrespective of what degree?
Yeah, I would say irrespective. I think that any intelligent person should, know some basics about economics and finance, because really everybody has to make some economic, business, and financial decisions. And if you don't have the basics, I mean, people don't even know the difference between stocks and bonds. Right. Stocks are considered, unquote, being more risky than bonds, and bonds are considered to be safer. But guess what? The bonds have what's called the market risk, because changes in interest rates change the market value of, say, long-term bonds. And they also have credit risk. The last few years we've seen countries that have defaulted on their debt. So, Italian savers bought a lot of Argentine bonds, and those were defaulted and they were wiped out. Right. So if you don't even know that bonds could be as risky or more risky than stocks, how can you make even basic decisions? The relation between the price and the bond and the yield is something, again, basic finance that most people don't have a clear understanding of.
About that basic finance, you talked about university. What was your early exposure to finance like, and take us into sort of why you decided to study economics? And did you learn financial literacy as a child? Did your parents instill that in you at a young age?
Well, I first of all grew up in a very international background. I was born in Turkey, then my family moved back to Iran. From there we went to Israel, and by the age of 5, I moved to Italy. So I always had a global perspective on what's happening, not just in the place where I am, but also in other parts of the world. I come from Middle East, I grew up in Europe, and then ended up in the United States. And I grew up in Italy at a time where there was a lot of social, political, and economic turmoil. This was in the 1970s when I was a teenager. You had the first oil shock following the Yom Kippur war between Israel and Iran, then you had the Iranian Revolution in '79, and we had this phenomenon that at that time was called stagflation, that you had economic stagnation, a recession, and high inflation at the same time. So I was trying to understand that was hurting economies, was hurting markets, was high unemployment rate in Europe, in the United States. So probably my intellectual curiosity towards economics and finance started by the fact that it was a period of very significant economic and financial difficulties in the US, in Europe, and in Italy when I was growing up. So I figured out I wanted to change the world for the better. I was not smart enough to be a true scientist, and political science was a bit too soft for me, so I decided economics was rigorous enough to understand in a coherent way the world, and something that actually could be usefully applied to do policy and be able to change the world for the better.
And so tell me, how important is this movement towards, you're seeing it, I know you're passionate about this, and that's one of the reasons you're launching Roubini's Edge. How important is it that we not only treat it sort of at a tertiary level, but fundamentally, whether it's education, whether it's within our system, actually look at this as a huge sort of policy initiative even, increasing financial literacy, especially in the United States?
I think it's key to increase this financial literacy, and there are many ways of doing it. And one of the objectives of launching this free newsletter and website is to make more accessible to a wider audience of people that are intelligent but maybe not experts of economic and finance, what are the key economic policy financial issues in the global economy, in US, in Europe, in Japan, in China, in emerging markets. Because as I pointed out, unless you follow the world day by day and figure out what's going on around the world, you might be totally clueless about stuff that's going to impact you, even individually. I mean, there are some sectors of the global economy going to completely disappear, and other ones are going to completely emerge. And probably the kind of world in which you could have the same job for 10, 20, 30 years is gone. So if you're a young person figuring out what you should study or where you should be working, which kind of education you should get, how much you should save, how much you should invest, and which kind of assets, domestic in the US or foreign, stocks, bonds, and others. Those are key things, and those are decisions you have to make every day of your life. And you need some basic knowledge of economics and finance that most people unfortunately don't have, and therefore this is a tool among many other ones. There are plenty of other ones that is going to make it more understandable to why it's important and why you should care about and why you should engage yourself in this understanding of what's happening in the world.
And I think that's a really interesting point. You say it's not just for people who are interested in what they might do as a career path, or someone like yourself who's going to dedicate them to sort of macroeconomics, but you're saying irrespective of what your career is, just having this basic idea of the undercurrents that shape these complexities and these intersections between politics and economics and government policies and all of that.
Yeah, it's important. I think that we are in a period of a massive transformation of the global economy. You have more globalization, trade in goods, in services, in capital, labor migration, technology, information. We have all these massive technological innovations that are going to increase productivity, but also shed tons of jobs in many sectors. We have this rising geopolitical risk, whether it's the Middle East or Russia, Ukraine, or some of the territorial disputes in Asia. We have these other major trends of global climate change and how it's going to affect the environment, demographic aging in advanced economies, and demographic dividend in emerging markets. We have lots of things are happening that are going to affect both economics, markets, individuals, personally as a group, and nations. Some nations are going to succeed, some of them are going to fail, and they have also very important implication in terms of increasing or decreasing social political unrest or creating tensions among states and interstate conflict and geopolitical risks. So these things of course affect your individual. What happens in the Middle East can affect you, because if there is going to be a shock to oil prices upward or downward, it affects your income, affects your jobs. And of course, if this turmoil continues, there's even risk of new acts of terrorism that could impact the United States or Europe. So all these things that happen around the world affect affect you individually. No country is an island, even a big country like the United States, and understanding what's happening within your country and globally, not just in economic and financial, but also political, geopolitical, and even some of the social and cultural trend is part of what makes us better human beings, better understanding what's happening, and better to make a variety of important decisions about our lives.
Absolutely, and it would seem that there's also a huge risk for any type of market or economy or a country if the population is, has as large a scale as we do of financial literacy in terms of the health of the market, the health of the economy. I mean, you were credited with predicting the 2008 financial crisis, and financial literacy, or the lack of it, had a lot to do with that.
It had a lot to do with it, because whenever you have, say, a credit or an asset bubble like the housing bubble in the United States, it was based on misconceptions. The average American thought that home prices could rise every year 10-15% forever, not realizing actually that those increases in home prices eventually are not sustainable. They're going to lead to a bust. So too many people bought homes with very little down payment and equity in their homes. They withdraw a lot of equity from their homes by using essentially their mortgage as an ATM machine. They spend too much, they save too little, and they put themselves vulnerable. And then when the bust occurred, it was not just for the country. People in the million lost their jobs, lost their income, lost their homes, lost their retirement wealth, and it has been dramatic. And the consequences of these severe financial crisis still affecting each one of us, even 6 years into this recovery. So these are things that really affect individual, and part of it was everybody was living in a bubble. The bankers were living in a bubble, the rating agency were living in a bubble, the policymakers and the regulator were living in a bubble, but even the average American was living in a bubble and was deluding himself or herself that this bubble will continue. And I think that lack of financial and economic literacy was one of the reasons why people believed this bubble could go on forever and didn't realize that actually it would bust. I wrote a whole book titled Crisis Economics. There's also a contribution to economic and financial literacy in which I explain that historically these boom and bubbles of asset and credit end up always in a bust and a crash, and they keep on repeating. And unless you learn about the past and the present, you're going to repeat the same mistakes in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Dr. Roubini, for joining us. We'll see you soon.
Great being with you today.